Welcome to Comics Bazaar, the channel of comics commentary and arcana. This video features the Uncanny X-Men Annual number 14, and this came out in the summer of 1990. 64 pages long and part 4 of a 4-part story that ran in the annuals of Fantastic Four, New Mutants and X-Factor that summer. So this cover is by Art Adams, and it features various members of the Fantastic Four, the New Mutants and X-Factor, as well as the villain of the crossover storyline, Ahab here, Master of Hounds. And in the foreground we've got adult Franklin Richards from the Days of Future Past storyline continuity that goes all the way back to Uncanny X-Men 141 and 142. And Rachel Summers, of course, and then that's young Franklin Richards from the present of Marvel continuity. So pretty striking cover there by Art Adams, and Art Adams at the top of his game by this point. This is his final X-Men annual, having done the art for X-Men annuals 9, 10 and 12. So let's open this one up. There's a contents page here to start, and there are in this annual 2 stories. The main one, you must remember this, written by Chris Claremont with amazing artwork by Art Adams and inks by a team of inkers: Dan Green, Bob Wiacek, Al Milgram, Art T-Bear and Steve Mancuso, and colours by Brad Van Kata, and letters by Tom Orzechowski. And then a second story, a shorter one, The Fundamental Things, also written by Chris Claremont and penciled by Mark Heike. So I'm not familiar with this artist's work otherwise than this particular annual, inked by Jeff Isherwood and coloured by Nell Yomtov with letters by Mike Heisler. And then we've got a Kevin Nolan pinup and an alternative cover by Michael Golden at the end of the annual. So this is the main storyline. You must remember this. A little bit of dialogue there from the 1942 film Casablanca. It left my mind there for a second, but anyway, from the famous song in the film. And so the story opens in Manhattan with Phoenix, Rachel Summers, at a diner, and she is having a deluxe cheeseburger with all the trimmings and getting ready to bite into it. And I always remember when I first read this how well Art Adams draws the food, and it's a rarity to see comics characters eating in comics. So this was a pretty tasty burger imagined up by Art Adams, and just great detail here on the Manhattan evening skyline, the detail of the architecture and street here, but a little bit muddied by the reproduction of the printing. And that goes back to issues with Marvel's printing in the late 80s, early 90s, the flexographic printing technique. It could result in some muddy looking artwork from artists who in particular loved filling their panels with fine lines and detail. So sometimes Art Adams' art could suffer from that, just the reproduction. And just as Rachel is tucking into her burger, the deli is visited by this trio of criminals who are looking to hold up the deli. And it's been observed before that they recall the villains from the first RoboCop movie, and that's what I saw this time around when I was looking at them actually. So Art Adams having a little joke there. And basically Rachel stays cool when these goons arrive in. And then I like this page here where she very quietly uses her powers, her telepathy and telekinesis, to deal with the trio. Knock them out, send them into a fugue state, as she explains later in her thoughts, and take apart their guns with her telekinesis, to the bafflement of the staff and other patrons of the diner. And just a little note there, if you can see this, that this little character here, or this character here, rather looks like Chris Claremont from the period. So Art Adams may be inserting a little version of Claremont into this drawing here. And then Rachel sees what for her might be a ghost, and it is Franklin Richards that she thinks she sees. But when she leaves the diner, he's disappeared, and so she flies up into the air using her powers, and sends out a telepathic call, which various characters, some well-known like Doctor Strange and Spider-Man, others just ordinary people, but with some kind of telepathic type ability, hear her calling out. And then Franklin makes himself seen. And he's been turning up in the other annuals, and most recently in X Factor annual. And they have a little dialogue here. Rachel and Franklin were lovers in Days of Future Past. And so they kiss, and then we get this really cool image of the Phoenix Force in the Manhattan nighttime sky. And then they arrive on top of the roof of Four Freedoms Plaza, and we get this chat between Franklin and Rachel with Cyclops and Mr. Fantastic and Sue Richards as well, regarding what's been going on in the stories in the previous annuals. And also here we should note that Jean Grey, Marvel Girl, is keeping to herself in the corner of this particular panel, and we'll see that there is an exploration in the storyline of the strained relationship between Rachel and Jean, daughter and mother, and Jean, of course, not having been pregnant with Rachel, and not even being married to Scott, and feeling that she's got no free will when she's got this adult daughter walking around that she really feels no connection to, and that will get explored throughout the story. So what happens here is that Franklin and Rachel are saying basically that they're going to head off, and there's some unfinished business though, which is what has Franklin done with Scott's baby, Christopher Nathan, and what about young Franklin Richards in this timeline, this present, because something that he did in the prior story was lock down and shut down young baby Franklin's powers, wiped them, and what he does is he uses his power to alter reality to give his parents a positive view of what he's doing and what he's suggesting doing. But he doesn't work that on Johnny and Ben. So they're aware that Franklin's been using his power to convince his parents to go along with his wishes. And we see also that Jean is not on board with what's going on and is uncomfortable. And she makes it plain here where she says, I'm face to face out of nowhere with the product of my life to come. Not only that, she's tied intimately into the power I abhor, that's Phoenix Force, and a world where all I hold dear has been destroyed. The future of Days of Future Past. It's like all the pieces of my life are locked into place without me having the slightest say. So you'll pardon me for not seeing any magic, special or otherwise, here. And Franklin tells Rachel not to worry about it, and that Rachel will always have him. So we have goodbyes, take two, But as Franklin and Rachel leave, Sue and Reed work out that they have been interfered with psychically, that there was a transitory reconfiguration of reality, as Reed infers. And Reed says he isn't hostile. That's Franklin. Simply directed, I fear to the point of obsession. He's desperately afraid, that much I sense. But of what? And seeking safety. To get it, he's prepared to do anything. And then our scene switches to the overground ruins of the X Mansion, destroyed by Mr. Sinister, and de-aged Storm, but this and Gambit. But this story takes place after the trilogy of 265, 266, and 267. And so at the end of 267, Storm gets her adult memories back, but she still is stuck in the preteen body that Nanny regressed her to. And as I said, we've got Gambit with her as well, following on from the end of 267. And Storm is explaining to Gambit what is the origin of the ruin of the mansion. She says the mansion was blown up by one of the X-Men's foes, Mr. Sinister. And Gambit replies, like the name. A man who dresses as you do, says Storm, and calls himself Gambit, is hardly in a position to cast aspersions. Now, this is an interesting little point here, because Claremont's original idea for Gambit was that he was to be a kind of polar opposite manifestation of an orphan child called Nate. And Nate manifested two different forms. Mr. Sinister, a kind of like a cliche type villain, and Gambit like a cliche cool anti-hero. But both of them dreamt up by a young boy, but long-lived, or aging slowly rather, but nonetheless kind of the products of the imaginations of a 10-year-old boy. So it's all quite complex. It didn't pan out that way, but some of the dialogue kind of is explained by reference to those original plots and plans of Claremont's for Gambit. Also, something to note here is that Gambit's costume is exactly like that. You can see it here on the leg, like the way that Andy Kubert draws the costume on the cover of 266, Gambit's first appearance. So it's not quite the reconfiguration of Jim Lee's ultimate and final costume design for Gambit, which was visible in the cover box of 266 and in the interior pages by Mike Collins. So obviously Art Adams working from an earlier design by Jim Lee here. So anyway, they enter into the underground complex through this hatch of the X Mansion, and who are they met with but by Cable. And this is the first encounter between Storm and Cable, and of course Gambit and everyone else down here. So we get a little 6-panel fight here between Storm and Cable. But of course Cable is huge and years of combat experience, and he takes down Storm easily enough. But then the X-Men and New Mutants arrive. So we've got Banshee there and Forge arriving in order to explain things. And this is the reunion after so very long between Storm and Forge. And it doesn't really get much treatment in the annual, so it's a little bit anticlimactic, because of course one of the reasons that Forge accompanied Banshee in searching for the missing X-Men was to find Storm, whom he knew was in trouble because of a vision he had in a dream vision state, and also when the Shadow King possessed Legion on Moor Isle. So we don't really get development of this here. There just isn't the time or space, even though we can see them side by side here. So maybe there's a kind of like an untold reunion between the two that there just isn't time to deal with because of the main storyline. And I just want to note here as well that in terms of Art Adams' art, he's just excellent at doing this, like packing the panels with a plethora of characters, like many characters, having them all standing in perspective at an angle. This is very difficult to draw, very difficult to do, but he does it so well. And also another thing too is that he really does pack the detail in, the characters into the panels, but it's also readable. Everything works in terms of who's speaking when, and our eyes going from left to right and down the page. So really great storytelling from Art Adams. And if you compare his work, like back in the Long Shot miniseries or X-Men Annual 9, you can see that he's really come very far in a short number of years working on these special projects. Yes. So we have a catch up in terms of what's been going on in previous annuals in terms of what Franklin Richards has been up to, and also a little detail on the antagonist Ahab, who's yet to show up here. And then we switch back to Four Freedoms Plaza and a chat over a cup of tea between Cyclops and Sue Richards, Invisible Woman, just as Cyclops and she are blindsided by Ahab and his hounds. So he captures them, and meanwhile downstairs we have a meeting of the X-Men, New Mutants, X-Factor, and Fantastic Four. So everybody is swapping notes, and they get on the case of finding Franklin and Rachel in this last panel here. So then we go back with Ahab and his lair, which he calls the tomb, and here he is in process of rewriting the genetic codes of Sue Storm and Cyclops in order to turn them into hounds, which is what we see here in Art Adams' designs of hound costumes for both. And that means that they are completely and utterly obedient to Ahab's every command. And so he sets them on the trail of their children. And interesting here too, this is a little interesting bit where Cyclops is unable to locate Rachel, and Ahab thinks to himself, that shouldn't be. He isn't lying, he genuinely doesn't know, but she's his daughter. Even her sight talent shouldn't be able to mask her from him. So is there a little question mark being raised here in terms of whether Cyclops is actually Rachel's father? Jean Grey is her mother, but is Cyclops her father? And a little bit more to say on that when I get to the second story in the annual. And then we have a scene set in Prospect Park, Brooklyn, where we catch up with Rachel and Franklin, and also Nathan Christopher, Cyclops' son, with Madeline Pryor. And that second story that I mentioned, in which we have an encounter between Wolverine, who's in Madripoor, and Rachel and Franklin, that takes place in between their disappearing from the roof of their Four Freedoms Plaza and this particular scene here. Okay, so I'll mention that again when we get to that part of the annual. So they're enjoying their little picnic in the park until it's rudely interrupted by Ahab and their parents who've been transformed into hounds. And Ahab uses his power, his whip, to disrupt the psyches of all three and subdue them. And then we catch up with him in his lair again, the tomb, where he has imprisoned Adolf Franklin and Nathan Christopher, and is working on Rachel to get her to obey him as a hound to its master. And as she's defying him, suddenly the cavalry's come to attempt a rescue, as he says himself. And so we've got this really cool splash page here from Art Adams, and we've got a combination of the Fantastic Four, X-Men, New Mutants, and of course X-Factor. So pretty cool stuff here. And then we have a fight, of course. And so the fight goes back and forth in terms of who's up and who's down. Great fight choreography from Art Adams throughout. And I just want to note, like, this panel here, this is what he's very good at. So you've got lots of action here on this panel. It's all very clearly delineated, easy to read, excellent storytelling. And again, with Art Adams, just this really mastery of fine detail in his drawing, which somewhat doesn't show up as well as it might because of this printing process. And just another thing to note here is that Gambit has switched over to the X-Men uniform, so he's put away his armor for the rest of the story. Then we have this odd little moment here where Cable tackles Ahab personally, and Ahab taunts him, "What's wrong, Cable? See someone you know?" And of course there is some vague similarity between Cable and Ahab in terms of their faces and the scar on their right eye. But otherwise there are differences. So a little bit of research turned up that basically this was meant to be a red herring, that this wasn't ever meant to be Cable's origin or something to do with his own personal story, but it was meant to keep readers kind of hunting around and thinking about who or what Cable's origin was. So in the midst of all of this, Ahab takes out everyone using this piece of technology on the floor. Everyone who's flesh and blood is subdued, and it reveals that that Franklin is not typically flesh and blood. And so, as Ahab asks, question is, what are you? What is Franklin exactly? And it turns out that every time Franklin uses his powers, Rachel is weakened, and baby Franklin from the present goes deeper into a sort of coma. So there's some kind of connection there going on in terms of the Franklin's usage of power. So then Ahab shoots his harpoon, or throws his harpoon at Rachel. An interesting DeLuca effect here, just two-figure DeLuca effect from Art Adams in that panel. And both Franklin is unable to stop the harpoon, and Jean Grey then has to come to the rescue and uses her TK power to stop the harpoon from striking her daughter Rachel. And then what happens is Ahab realizes he's bested, that he's lost this battle, but he knows how the war ends. Whatever you do to me now, you'll still meet me in the days to come. Sooner or later, I'll have your heads. In the meanwhile, every time you look at Cyclops and the Invisible Woman, you'll see my mark on their faces. And then he teleports away with an interesting sound effect, the BAMF sound effect that is associated with Nightcrawler. So here's the aftermath. So Ahab has been defeated for the moment, but what to do with Cyclops and Sue Storm, who have been rewritten at a genetic level. So this is something that that is going to test Beast, Forge, and Reed Richards to come up with some way of doing it, but it's pretty much impossible. And here in the meanwhile, we have some sense that there's something up with Franklin, yes? So it turns out that Franklin is an anomaly that Storm knows from what she learned from adult Kate Pryde in the body of Kitty Pryde back in Uncanny X-Men 141 and 142, Days of Future Past, that Franklin died in the future, that he was killed by Sentinels, that he shouldn't be alive. How can he be alive? And so what it turns out is he is an astral, psychic remains of himself. He is a type of ghost. He's not truly alive. And so he decides to use his power one last time to restore everything as it should be, even as Rachel is weakening here, because he's leeching his power from baby Franklin in the present and from Rachel also, because they've got a connection, which is of course their romantic relationship. So then he goes into this machine with baby Franklin to give him back his powers, restore everything. Rachel also uses the Phoenix Force too to correct things. And so as Franklin discorporates, he says in his message to her, "I never got to see you as Phoenix in all your glory, a sight to remember, a memory to treasure. Farewell, my love." And everything is restored to normal then. Young Franklin is back to himself. And Sue is back to herself. And then, strikingly, Rachel finds herself once more in her hound costume. And the whole question is, does this mean, as she asks, that we failed? The future's left unchanged? Did Franklin die for nothing? Nothing wasn't once bad enough. Do I have to live through that nightmare all over again? And here we come to this strained mother-daughter relationship where Jean feels like maybe she would like to comfort Rachel, but is unable to. And then Rachel basically leaves. She feels that she's alone. She'll have to start fresh and make her own home and her own family. And so she leaves. And Jean is ambivalent about everything in these panels. So then we have the aftermath, and interesting little fun bits here from Art Adams with Warlock, and Warlock is playing Star Wars with Franklin and with Nathan Christopher, and we have a little bit of Starstruck love for Boom Boom with Johnny Storm. And we have Reed, who sent a probe into the near future to find out whether the Days of Future Past timeline is there or not. But the probe was destroyed because of a time bubble that they recently encountered. So he thinks it's for the best that they can't check and see. And he says the only way to determine the future, my friends, is by living through it. Forewarned, though, Reed is forearmed, finishes Storm. So a little hint of the relationship between Forge and Storm continuing here, with Storm, as I said earlier, restored to her adult memories and identity, even if her body isn't. And then we have this farewell between the different teams. And again, just another version of this strength of Art Adams, the tilted plane and all the characters perfectly in perspective, difficult to do. And here again we've got Jean in the corner, holding her arms in a kind of a self-comforting gesture and separate from everybody else. And then the last page, epilogue so to speak, where Jean, taking a hint from Rachel, goes back to her parents' home, Rachel's grandparents' home, near Bard College, where Jean's father was a professor. And there is the crystal that was given by Lilandra to Jean's parents at the end of the Dark Phoenix saga, when Phoenix had killed herself on the moon. And in it was originally Jean's essence, but now it contains Rachel's too. So, as the dialogue, or the captions indicate, all Jean has to do to know them. Sorry, I'll start here. Family, Reed Richards said, we're all family. And Ororo said that meant the world. And Rachel said, her essence, the totality of her life and being, warts and all, was in this crystal, hers and Phoenix's, and all Jean has to do to know them, to grasp this embodiment of past and future, and in a way accept it as her present, her destiny, is to pick it up. So, a moment of choice, decision, free will, agency. It's up to Jean now to determine what she does in relation to her relationship with Rachel. And so a very nice conclusion, wonderfully drawn by Art Adams. Sometimes Art Adams, you could see him with some of his work, famously a very slow artist, that in some of the final pages of his work, the backgrounds disappear as he's rushing to a deadline. Obviously, he had all the time he needed for this because there's no scrimping on backgrounds throughout this annual story. So a great artistic exit from him from the X-Men annuals. And then we get a second story, much shorter, set in Madripoor and featuring Jubilee, Psylocke and Wolverine. And last seen in the main title with in Uncanny X-Men 261. So Jubilee doing as she did in her first appearance in 244, putting on a fireworks display for the amusement of a gathered crowd. But her little display is interrupted by Wolverine in his patch disguise, who tells her that they've got to keep a low profile. So she's not having any of that, and she upbraids him for smoking cigars while he's still recovering from the wounds he received when he was crucified by Donald Pierce and the Reavers in the outback in Australia. He even has to sit down here, but he continues to smoke a cigar. And basically, he tells Jubilee about the bigger picture concerning the X-Men, fills her in on the X-Men because she doesn't at this point know much about them. So he gives her a little potted history of the need for the X-Men, Charles Xavier's dream of peaceful coexistence between humankind and mutants. And then there's a little callback to the fact that Jubilee at this point is still suspicious of Psylocke because of how the Hand transformed her into their master assassin, but ultimately she broke free from it, and Jubilee's skeptical as regards whether she truly is free or not. And then we get Wolverine narrating a lot of words on this page, some of the main events in X-Men history. X-Men number 1 here with the original 5 tackling Magneto. We have the creation of the Sentinels by Bolivar Trask. And then suddenly out of nowhere, we have the arrival of Franklin and Rachel. And to the surprise of Jubilee, because they truly do pop out of nowhere. And this is recognized in the psychic dialogue between Psylocke and Jubilee. I don't know either Jubilee. Some shield inhibits my telepathic scans of them. So really, it turns out Franklin and Rachel are there to visit Wolverine, and he continues with his story on Jubilee's prompting about the second generation of X-Men, going back to Giant Size X-Men number 1, the death of Thunderbird here, and various iterations of the team. Great drawing here by this artist, kind of in the style of a little bit. I see a little bit of Neil Adams. I see a little bit of John Byrne. Pretty nicely done, and very difficult. Like to tackle this script here. You can see from all the panels on page. You can see what's demanded of the artist here to get all of this down. And then we have a little bit of a callback to a a violent encounter between Wolverine and Rachel Phoenix, when Rachel was thinking about killing Selene, the Black Queen, and how Wolverine intervened and stabbed through flesh and bone to her heart with his adamantium claws. She never thought he would, in a way that hurt far more than the wound itself. And Wolverine tells her, you learn anything from that. The stronger you are, the more power you possess, the more you need limits. So this is really the heart of the rest of this story. Wolverine being the voice of conscience for those with great power, and reiterating the point that with great power comes great responsibility, explicitly a little later on. And really he's talking to Phoenix, yes, but he's talking more so to Franklin Richards, because Franklin has immense power. He's able to rewrite reality, and for him it's wrong. He doesn't recognize Psylocke and Jubilee, and so he winks them out of existence in effect. And Wolverine plays it cool here in terms of talking Franklin into undoing what he's done. And some of the best parts of his speech come here. We are X-Men, he says. There's a reason people call us heroes. We stand for something, a dream, an ideal. I hope for something better than we are. What we do, how we act, matters. There's a saying, boy, that means as much now, blazes maybe more, as when it was first coined. With great power comes great responsibility. Abandon that ideal, and everything you do, regardless of how noble the motives, will turn to dust. And he says, and if it's dust already, Franklin, anguished, asks, as long as you exist, there are always options. And if you're playing an end game, then you've got to ask yourself how you want to be remembered, what kind of legacy you want to leave behind. Lies don't last, boy, and a life built on them stands on sand. And Rachel agrees. And so ultimately, Wolverine talks Franklin around to bringing back Psylocke and Jubilee. So they pop back into reality here. And the final words between Franklin and Wolverine are important here, where Franklin says, you realize, of course, that by preserving your past, you may have condemned the future. And Wolverine responds, anything's possible. You want guarantees, boy. Write a book. But which would you rather leave behind as your legacy? The best of you or the worst? So interesting here, there's a little thematic chiming, mirroring, resonation between the main story in the first part of the annual and this story, in terms of larger questions about destiny, predetermination, the degree of agency one has over one's life, and free will. So philosophical ideas being explored in this annual, and interesting too to see Wolverine now as the conscience of the X-Men in this book, given his origins not his origins, but his original attitude and characterization in Giant Size X-Men #1 and in the early issues by Claremont, where he was very much a scrapper, very much a guy who was angry and acting on instinct, and then over time has become much cooler headed and a font of wisdom and conscience. So Jubilee says to him, you know, you're looking awfully pleased with yourself at the end. And he says, yup, what, you figured this was some kind of win? Not some kind of win, Jubilee, a big one of the best. And he got Franklin to shake his hand at the end. And here's looking at you, kid. A little quotation again from Casablanca. And then we have that pin-up by Kevin Nolan of the male members of the Outback team. And then the alternative cover for the annual by Michael Golden. It's a pretty nice drawing by Golden there. But obviously the editorial went with the cover by Art Adams. So I do hope that you enjoyed this review of X-Men Annual number 14. part 4 of 4 of the Days of Future Present storyline that ran across the Fantastic Four, New Mutants and X-Factor annuals in the summer of 1990. So if you like this video, please hit the like button, and if you haven't done so already, subscribe to the channel and stay tuned for more content like this.